The room was quiet, save for the crackling of the fire. Outside, the wind howled and the rain beat against the windows. It was the kind of evening that made the world outside feel distant, distant enough that time seemed to slow down. The fire flickered in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. You were sitting at the old wooden table, the smell of the aged wood mixing with the comforting scent of smoke. Grandpa, sitting in his favorite chair by the fire, was dozing off, his worn face peaceful for the moment. His hands rested on the arms of the chair, his knuckles showing signs of years of hard work, and his eyes, though clouded with age, still sparkled when they looked at you. After a while, Grandpa stirred and straightened up in his chair. He glanced at you, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips.
Ha ha! Not too often I get to sit with you like this, huh? But I suppose there's no better time than on a night like tonight. Storm's got the world locked out, doesn't it?
You nodded, feeling the weight of the moment settle around you. There was something about storms that seemed to bring out stories in Grandpa, something he always said about the quiet that follows after the noise. Grandpa cleared his throat, then leaned forward a bit, his voice taking on a faraway tone, as though he was recalling something that had happened ages ago.
You know, I've been meaning to tell you a story about a time when I was your age, maybe a little younger. It was a different kind of storm back then, and it had nothing to do with rain. It was the kind of storm that changes you forever. It was the summer of '48. I was just a boy, maybe 12 or 13. My father had just bought a new farm, an old place, not far from town. It was supposed to be a fresh start for the family, but sometimes a fresh start can bring more than you bargained for. Now, it wasn't long after we moved in that I met the old man. He lived down the road, an old widower. Name was Amos Morrow. He wasn't much for company, never had much to say when folks would pass by his house. But if you caught him at the right moment, well, that's when the stories started. He had a way of talking that made you feel like you were hearing something you weren't supposed to hear. He used to sit out on his porch in the evenings, watching the sunset. I'd walk by on my way home from town, and sometimes I'd stop. The way he'd look at the horizon, it was as if he was waiting for something. You know the kind of stare I'm talking about, don't you?
You nodded, though you weren't sure if you did. Grandpa smiled faintly.
Well, one evening, I stopped to talk to him. Nothing unusual about it. I thought it was just an old man's rambling. But Amos looked at me real serious-like and said, "There's something you need to understand about the land you're working, boy. It ain't like the land in town. You might think it's all just dirt, but that soil, it's got memories, things that happened before you ever set foot on it." I laughed it off. A lot of folks would have, but Amos just kept staring at me. "Don't take that land lightly," he warned, "and whatever you do, don't mess with the old barn. You stay away from that barn."
The barn?
You asked.
"Yeah, the barn. Dad was always a hard worker, you know that. He built everything from scratch, the house, the stables, the fence. But there was one thing he never could bring himself to touch, and that was the old barn that was already there. See, I came to learn that that barn had a reputation. People around town would talk about it, always in hushed voices. They said the land it sat on wasn't just land. It had memories. Hearing that again and again made me rethink everything Amos told me days prior. Now, these are not the kind of memories you'd want to have. The kind of memories that stick with you and don't let go.
The fire crackled again, but the storm outside seemed to rise in intensity, as if the wind itself was pushing against the house, urging Grandpa to continue. He hesitated for a moment, eyes fixed on the dancing flames, before he leaned in closer to you.
I didn't understand what they meant back then, but I started to feel it. When we first moved in, it was peaceful, you know? But after a while, things started to feel wrong. And it wasn't just me. My brother felt it too. My parents would just brush it off. But we knew something wasn't right.
Grandpa's voice dropped to a whisper and you leaned in, hanging on every word.
You see, that barn and that land were actually owned way back when by Amos himself. We bought it from the man that owned it after him. Throughout the years prior, folks in town started saying he wasn't quite right. Something about him. Something about the land he lived on. And it wasn't until after he passed away that people started to really notice the strange things happening around that place. Us included.
Grandpa's voice trailed off as he gazed into the fire, his expression clouded with something you couldn't quite place. After a moment, he sighed and looked at you.
The barn was the heart of it all, and that's when Amos's story began to unravel. But that's a tale for another time, one that I'm not sure I'm ready to tell. Not yet.
You felt a shiver run down your spine. Grandpa had always been a man of few words, but the way he spoke now was different. It wasn't the familiar tone he used for the funnier stories, the tales of mischievous adventures and pranks. This one was heavier. It weighed on the air between you.
I'll tell you more about it later. But take it from an old man when I say this. Some things you don't mess with. And some places, well, they stay with you, even when you leave.
As the storm continued to rage outside, Grandpa's words hung in the air, heavy and unsettling. You felt the temperature in the room drop, even though the fire was still burning brightly. A chill ran through you, though you couldn't say if it was the storm or something else entirely. Grandpa leaned back in his chair, his eyes half closed, as if he was trying to summon more from the past. His fingers drummed lightly on the armrest, a sound that felt like a warning, the rhythm almost hypnotic.
You see, boy, there was something strange about that barn. It wasn't just a structure. It was as if it held something trapped inside it. And when we first moved there, we all felt it. I'm sure you felt it yourself, right? You ever go into an old building, something that's been abandoned, and it feels like the walls are watching you? That's how that barn felt, like it was alive, all the time.
Grandpa paused, eyes narrowing. He didn't speak for a long time, the only sound in the room coming from the fire. Finally, he broke the silence.
After a few weeks of living there, strange things started happening. Things you couldn't explain. At night, when the wind would howl, the barn would creak and groan like it was shifting, moving. And every morning, I'd wake up to find the barn doors wide open, even though no one had gone near them. I'll never forget the first time I really noticed it. My father was out working in the barn trying to fix it up. He always believed in hard work, you know? But I had a feeling that I shouldn't be anywhere near it. And I wasn't the only one. My brother, he was younger than me, always full of energy. One night, after dinner, he decided he was going to take a look around the barn. He didn't say anything to anyone, just slipped out while the rest of us were still inside. It wasn't until hours later that we realized he was gone. We searched all over the place. My father shouted his name. My mother cried, but there was no sign of him. Not until we heard the sound of the barn doors slamming shut.
The wind outside howled even louder, its banshee wail echoing through the cracks in the walls. But it felt almost distant now, drowned out by the rising tension in the room. Grandpa paused as if the memory was too heavy to bear. His hands, gnarled with age, twitched slightly, as though still feeling the remnants of the fear he had experienced all those years ago.
By the time we found my brother, it was well after midnight. I remember how cold it was that night, how the temperature had dropped so quickly. We couldn't even hear the crickets anymore. It was like the entire world had fallen silent, as if it was holding its breath. We went to the barn. My father's face was pale. He knew something was wrong. You could feel it deep in your gut. And that's when we heard it, the sound of those massive barn doors creaking open like something was pushing against them. But no one was there. No one had touched them. It was as though something inside was making its way out. My father hesitated. I could see the fear in his eyes. He didn't want to go inside. He didn't want to face whatever was in there. But he had no choice. The silence had grown too heavy, and we couldn't leave my brother out there alone.
Grandpa paused again, and for a moment, his eyes wandered, as if seeking the words to explain what happened next. His expression grew darker.
We found him in the corner of the barn, sitting on the floor, his knees pulled up to his chest, eyes wide open, staring at something I couldn't see. It was like he was in a trance, frozen, not responding to our voices. We called his name, shook him, but he didn't move. I'll never forget the look in his eyes, as if he'd seen something that shattered him.
What did he see?
You asked, barely above a whisper. Grandpa's eyes darkened as he shook his head slowly.
I don't know. We never got a word out of him about what happened in that barn that night. He couldn't speak about it. And after that, he was never the same. He became withdrawn, distant. And my father, he stopped working in that barn. He refused to go near it. But things didn't end there. That's when I started noticing the other things, the whispers in the night. You'd hear them faintly, like soft voices carried by the wind. They seemed to come from the barn, but when you'd go out there, there was nothing. Nothing but the old building, creaking in the night air like it was alive, watching.
The fire crackled loudly, its warmth offering little comfort against the cold feeling growing in your chest. Grandpa's voice remained steady, but you could hear the edge of fear still in it, decades later.
I wasn't the only one who heard them. My brother's condition got worse after that night. He stopped speaking altogether, and I started seeing things, shadows, flickers in the corner of my eyes, always near the barn. But when I'd look directly, there was nothing. The land, the barn, it was like it was feeding on our fear, slowly breaking us down. I thought of Amos. We were forced to leave. We couldn't stay there anymore. But even after we moved, the whispers followed. I don't know if it was in my head or if it was real, but I could hear them in the silence of the night, calling us back to the barn, demanding us to come back.
You felt an icy shiver run down your spine as Grandpa's words took root in your mind. The idea that something could be alive on that land, that it could reach out to you even after you thought you'd escaped. The fire crackled again, the sound oddly comforting now compared to the cold unease spreading through you. Grandpa fell silent for a long while, staring into the flames as if he could still see that barn, still feel the grip of it all these years later. The room felt heavy, the air thick with the unspoken things between you. Finally, Grandpa broke the silence.
Leaving that farm, it didn't make the land forget about us, and it sure didn't make it forget about what it had done. I never went back to that barn, not after that night. But there was one thing I couldn't shake, one thing I had to know. What happened to Amos Morrow? Why was he so obsessed with that place?
Grandpa's fingers curled tightly around the armrest of his chair, his knuckles whitening. He exhaled slowly, as if summoning the strength to speak further.
It was a few months after we'd moved, and I was back in town. I'd been helping a local farmer with some work, and I heard a strange thing about Amos. People started saying he'd been gone from his house for several weeks before he died, disappeared from town entirely, and no one had seen him go. It was like he'd just vanished. And when they found him, they said he was found near the barn, but not alive. They found him in pieces.
You blinked, unable to process what Grandpa was saying.
What do you mean? How?
Grandpa grimaced and his eyes narrowed.
They found him, but it wasn't like anyone expected. His body was scattered in the fields as if he had been torn apart. Not by an animal either. No, this was something else. It was as if whatever haunted that land had finally come for him, claimed him. And here's the part that doesn't make sense. They found his old journal, buried under the floorboards of his house. I never read it, but my father did. He said it was filled with warnings. Warnings about the barn, about the land. And at the end, there was something strange written in it, something in his handwriting that wasn't his. At the end of the journal, it said one thing: the barn never sleeps. I don't know what Amos meant by that, but whatever it was, it stayed. It stayed with me, and it stayed with that land. I'll never forget the way the barn looked that night we left. It was like it was waiting for something, waiting for us to come back.
The storm outside began to subside, the wind dying down, but the silence inside the room was unbearable. Grandpa stared into the fire, his face a mask of sorrow and regret. For a long moment, neither of you spoke. The only sound in the room was the crackling of the fire, the distant thunder rolling through the night. Grandpa's eyes grew distant as he stared into the fire, the shadows on the walls dancing as though they too were part of the haunting tale he had just shared. You could see the weight of the years in his face, the memory of that farm and the barn still etched deeply in him. But there was something more, something unsaid, lingering in the air.
I've lived a long life since then, but that barn, that land, it's never really left me. It stays with you, you know, even when you try to forget.
You nodded slowly, still processing everything Grandpa had just shared. The barn, the whispers, Amos's journal. It all felt like a twisted nightmare, something you couldn't quite shake off.
Grandpa, do you think the barn is still there?
Grandpa's gaze shifted from the fire to you, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he didn't answer. The storm outside had finally calmed, the air now heavy with an eerie silence that seemed to seep into the room.
Sonny, I have no idea, but I'll tell you this. There are things in this world that we don't understand. Some places are special, not in a good way. And sometimes, no matter how far you run, those places will keep calling you back.
The fire crackled one last time, and as it burned down to embers, you sat in silence, feeling the weight of Grandpa's words settle around you. You would never forget that night, that story. And though you didn't know it yet, the barn's calling was something you would never escape either. Just then, as if on cue, a strange noise broke through the quiet, a faint scratching sound from somewhere deep inside the house. You froze, your heart skipping a beat. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was coming from the walls, slow, deliberate scratches. Grandpa's face twitched, a shadow of something that almost looked like fear crossing his features. He slowly rose from his chair, and for the first time in hours, you saw the hesitation in his step.
That sound. Oh, it's been a long time since I've heard that.
The hairs on the back of your neck stood on end as the scratching grew louder, more frantic. Grandpa moved toward the door leading to the basement, his face drawn with something you hadn't seen before. Uncertainty.
Grandpa, what's happening?
Oh, I have a guess, but I hope I'm wrong, Sonny. I think it's time to find out. Again, stay close. Whatever is calling us back, it's here.
With those final words, he opened the door, the old wood creaking loudly, and you followed him into the darkness below. The air grew colder, the smell of dust and mildew thicker. But as you descended, your mind raced. Was it the barn, or something more? Something that had followed you here, beyond the farm and across the years? As you stepped deeper into the basement, the lights flickered and you heard a soft scrape. It was coming from somewhere deeper within the house. Grandpa turned to you, his face as pale as a ghost, his voice a tight whisper.
Oh, Sonny, there's more to this house than I ever told you, more than you could possibly imagine. I'm so sorry.
And just before the door closed behind you, you could have sworn you heard something whisper from the walls.
Come back